I am a museum professional that is very similar. I used to be a teacher, an administrator of Chicago schools when I opened my museum. Today, Chicago and the suburbs has 1.5 million inhabitants, Mexican inhabitants. When I first started working in museums, I felt Chicago needed a place where the beauty and richness of Mexican culture would exist for Mexican community, but also for all Chicago inhabitants. From the very beginning, Mexicans and non-Mexicans attended our museum. Our philosophy is a borderless culture, and that is why we promote Mexican art on both sides of the border. Our museum is located in a city of Mexican immigrants very near Chicago downtown. When I started, I would talk with people in the world of art and the world of ideas, and everyone thought I was mad. They would say, how can you open a museum in a workers' neighborhood? How is it that you want to have an art museum in a workers' community? And how are you going to have a free of charge museum? That's impossible. And there's something I learned very soon. I love art, I love culture, but in many ways the world of art and the world of museums is very elitist, and they are not interested in serving everyone. They just want to serve the very few, and that has not changed much. And I would like to share a story of something that happened to me in a conference of AAM that is supporting this event, and of which I am a member of the board. 3 people in the conference were signaling at me, and I felt that they wanted to say something to me. And at the very end, one of them told me very aggressively, he told me, you do not behave as if you belonged in a normal museum. There is an agenda in every museum. And I said, thank you. I know that it was meant as an insult, but I would like to thank them because I don't understand how what you want. I want to change the concept of a museum. A museum should be more than a place with good collections and good exhibits. I want to be perfectly clear. Many people working at museums say that museums don't have agendas. That is not true. Every museum has an agenda. We are very open and we say that we have an agenda. For instance, most large art museums in the United States teach European art in their main galleries. Isn't that an agenda? Of course it is. And there are plenty of examples like that. To begin with, we wanted to have a very new and different museum. We wanted a museum that would have first-rate exhibits, but we also wanted a museum that would change the concept of what a museum is. Education has always been very important to us. A quarter of the budget of the museum is allocated to education. We have several different programs, several education programs, both at the museum and at schools. And as you can see in our pictures, in the pictures we're showing, we've organized some great exhibits. We also feature lots of live art events, music, dance, art, literature. And we do that not only in the museum, but in different parts of Chicago. We are famous for our Dia de los Muertos exhibit, which is the largest across the country. Something very important to us is supporting contemporary artists and especially local artists. I'm always amazed that most large art museums barely teach local artists or do not have a permanent exhibit for the local artists, and that's very bad. I've always told artists that they should object to this policy. They pay taxes, and many museums receive tax money. So in my view, those museums have an additional obligation to support local artists. This is yet another example of the faults that we find with museums and the art world. Popular art is very important to us, and we've had many popular art museums, and we've invited many Mexican popular art museums, such as Carlomagno, that is going to talk shortly. The museum has a permanent program in a different building with the Mexican community that is dedicated to youth, and it offers paint, dance classes, and many other programs. And many of our youngsters found work in the world of art, and we are the only museum that has won 2 White House awards. Every year, we organize a festival for Children's Day, which is not only an art festival. We also offer dentist care and blood tests and so on and so forth. I do not know of any other museum across the country that work with so many people in their exchange programs. It is very important for us to invite people from all over the world. It's very important to work with everyone. And here are a couple of examples of some programs we've organized. We've had many programs with the gay community. The Mexican community is very conservative in many ways, and I've always asked myself how we can struggle for Mexican culture instead of fighting for the human rights of other communities. And I believe that sometimes being a leader is not doing what the community wants, but taking the community to a whole different level of issues that matter. We and many other groups use the museum for many different activities that are not generally hosted by museums. In this picture, we see that we have blood drives, campaigns. We had some events with women over 50 that had never had a mammograph before, and there is a nurse teaching them how to test themselves for tumors. And African Presence in Mexico exhibition is one of the largest exhibitions we have, and was sent to several museums. Not even in Mexico did they organize such a large exhibit on African presence, and I'm happy that tomorrow we are going to have talk about the presence of Africa in the Americas. I am extremely proud of being Mexican, and being Mexican and my family have been the 2 single most important things in my life. But Mexico is not perfect, And essentially, sometimes Mexico does not see indigenous culture with respect. There's huge discrimination against indigenous people, and Mexico is a place where a blonde one like me is treated better than an indigenous person. And we've had many exhibits of indigenous culture, both from the past and from the present, and we've supported some declarations. And during the presidential campaign in 2008, the Declaration of Immigration was a campaign where we invited many groups to sign this bill to support immigrants. The opposition and the official and incumbent party were attacked by this declaration. We have this philosophy that we want to be part of the community, and we want to be a part of the community.
Antônio Vieira. After me, he had a master's degree in social memory. He's currently working with museums in the community, and he's part of the La Guia Social em Brasil.
Bom, eu não peço desculpas, eu não falo espanhol nem.
I would like to apologize because I don't speak Spanish or English.
Dá para entender pouquinho o que a gente fala, né?
I hope that my colleagues can understand what I'm saying.
Eu vou falar da experiência.
Since we're so proximate to each other, we're going to talk about our experience in Maré, the largest area
bairros populares
of low-class populations and slums that we have in Rio de Janeiro. Next year, Rio de Janeiro will be the seat of the Olympics. It's a city known for its natural beauty, but it's also a city that faces major challenges and problems. I come from a place where we live in a constant situation, stressful situation, because there's a latent issue that's violence, presence of armed groups, wrong intervention by the armed forces and government enforcement authorities. So now my major challenge would be to work with this remote control. Maré is a neighborhood with 140,000 inhabitants, 16 communities, and each slum or shantytown has been created ever since 1940, and they keep growing until today. We're talking about 32,000 homes or households. It's a very large city. This is Maré's map. On the right, there's the Guanabara Bay, a part of it, because Maré has that specific feature. It was built on almost the sea. The houses were built on pillars. Each color represents a different community. There's also a latent issue, and that's the invisible borders. Each one of those areas is ruled by drug trafficking lords. We have different commanders, Comando Vermelho, Comando dos Comandos. They have an offensive presence with the community, and they keep facing each other and fighting against each other in territorial wars. They dominate the territory, and as a result of this, a youngster from one community cannot relocate to a different community because he may consider it an enemy. We are facing extreme poverty. That's where I was born. I was born from a family of immigrants who came from Northeast Brazil. That's where I was raised, and this is where my family settled. This is the community. This is how we came to see it first. The residents have had to resist throughout history in order to continue living there. This is a history that has a lot of value to us. The government engaged in different occupation projects to help that area. We are close to a large university, a technological center, and on the corner there's the international airport. Anyone who flies to Rio de Janeiro will go through the Red Highway or Vermelha Highway, and there's a walled area where the Maré community is located. On the side of the highway, there's a barrier, a wall, so that residents will not be bothered with the noise of the highway, but it's also a way to turn in this community into an invisible community. And now different schools were built, so they are trying to bring down the walls to show visitors that schools are being built in this area. Different strategies had to be made. The people were building houses on the sea directly using pillars or palafites. These columns were torn down by the government. And the houses came apart. So the families stayed inside the house, so that when a family was inside one of those houses, the government couldn't bring the house down. Another strategy was to replace wooden houses for material or concrete houses. They started filling these lands and they started building using bricks inside the wood. Then they pulled out the wooden layer, and the government could not tear apart these brick-walled houses. It has a very rich history that was a result of the struggle by residents. This is how houses were in 1960. The streets were covered with wood. And this is a more recent image. It's a highly populated area, and the museum was created as a part of trying to see how we can deal with this reality, violence, denial. Youngsters feel no sense of belonging with the environment. They want to work, they want to move out, they want to get a good job and move their families out of this area. So how can we work on that? When I lived through that, I felt ashamed for living in a shanty town. I was one of the only youngsters who got a scholarship at the university, but I had to hide my condition. I didn't tell my mates at university where I lived. I told them I lived in an urbanized area, and I never told anyone that I lived in a shanty town. There were many challenges for us, violence, so we decided that we could work through memory. The idea was to deconstruct the discourse and the belief that this is a location where drug was traded, where violence took place, where things could only be forgotten. And the museum focuses on this perspective. We worked on an empty warehouse because many plants and manufacturing companies left the area due to violence. So we started interviewing residents, we had some exhibitions, and the idea was to put up an exhibition that would tell the story of our community from a different perspective. It's not somebody speaking on behalf of ourselves. It was about us speaking for us, for ourselves. We called on the community and asked them to tell us how they would envisage a museum. Museums bring along many prejudices based on the building, about objects that cannot be touched, and most of times you do not relate to museums. They do not represent you, and if they do, they misrepresent you. So I have 2 minutes, so I have to rush through what's left of my presentation. This is a house, one of our core elements of the museum. The house is a house built on piles, on these columns. There are no longer these type of houses in the community, but it was a way of life that was used by many, many families for many years. I have a minute left, and I haven't even started. This is the opening of the museum. This is a cultural point. Well, I won't be able to tell you about. This was a government program, and we decided to develop this museum as a tool to transform reality and to face the problems that we had. Gilberto Gil, the Minister of Culture in 2006, and these are some of the actions that we developed. The lady with a radio player, that was a very common object in the community. There's nothing exotic or of high value. The value of our objects is symbolic. It's rather sentimental or affectionate value. I'm sorry, I won't be able to tell you about all the things we do, but we do carry out interviews with the older residents of the community, and these are some of the workshops. For example, to build kites. Kids today do not know how to build their own kites, so we have a workshop to teach them. These are the different exhibits that we have on the different parks with all images of the community. It's not about reinforcing our past of suffering and misery, but rather for having a different perspective and to see how the space was transformed by the residents. The residents donated most of our objects, so it's a work in progress. This museum is work in progress, same as the shanty towns or slums. I saw that in Argentina. Shanty towns are starting to grow, same as in Brazil. And it's a process. People have to feel that they are building this process. These are day-to-day objects, immigration objects, because these communities were built by immigrants. I'm sorry, but I'm out of time. Can I show the pictures at least? This is time of resistance, faith, religion. We work around different topics. We place high value in culture and religion. African, Brazilian religions that are prosecuted against because drug traffickers are becoming evangelists, so they are prosecuting African religions. This is the Temple of Fear. It talks about violence. This installation was built by the residents. We put together a workshop. They talked about violence. They made molds with local artists, and they looked on their own houses bullet marks. And with those marks of violence, they built very colorful bricks. And there's also a panel for marks of violence on the bodies. That's why we're collecting X-rays from people that were hit by bullets. It's impossible to tell you what we're doing in 10 minutes. I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much for your attention. Museums transform lives, as they have done with my life.
Presidente va a ser Nicolás Testoni, nació en Bahía Blanca, en Argentina, en 1900.
Nicolás studied communication sciences at the University of Buenos Aires. In 1997, he started collaborating with the Museum of the Port of Engineer Wide and the realization of videos, and in 2004 he worked in the museum workshop in Genuine, an institution where he currently is the director, and he's won several fellowships from different foundations throughout the world, and he's from Argentina.
Argentina!
To begin with, I don't know whether we have the presentation. Actually, the black screen is part of the presentation. I am in no position to make sure that Ferrowhite... Oh, actually, I need to wait for the images because they are synced with the text I'm going to read. Or maybe I will just read without the images. I am in no position to guarantee that Ferrowhite change anyone's lives. Or, in any way, it's not our place at the museum to say that, but we know that this museum would not be what it is. Okay, great. But this museum would not have become what it is without the trajectory of tons of people. So to introduce 10 years of work in 10 timed minutes, we thought we could tell you a little bit about two of those people, Adolfo Repetti and Pedro Caballero, or about how Adolfo, Pedro, and many others changed the way in which we understand this museum, what is its patrimony, and what is its value. Ferrowhite is a railroad museum where most of the objects were donated by the railroad. They were not donated by the private concessionaires either. All of these objects are at the museum because some railroad workers took them from where they laid. With or without the consent of their bosses, they took them home. No one would say that they stole those things because they took them when they knew what was the fate of the state-owned company. That is, when it became evident that the true theft was that confirmed by the minister. It is true that not everyone that took something brought it to the museum, but if we don't have a train machine, is because no one was able to put it in a bag. One of my first jobs at Ferrowhite was to walk with Adolfo Repetti to go pick up some tools from the old hotel in Bahia Blanca. And I remember that because they were heavy. I mean, it was hard. And it was during one of those trips that I felt that pain in my waist. That reminds me that I will not be young forever. I am the one in pain there, in the left. So that tool could be left where it was, end up in the foundation, and my waist would have been unharmed, at least for a while. But that's not the way it went. It ended up in the museum, and once and again, the kids hammered, tan, go the visitors that come to our museum on Sundays to find themselves mortal. And maybe it was because of that, because those that in the 90s stole from a thief understood that what they had stolen was not part of their personal memory, but was instead the link to a history that was considerably broader. A country where the railroad company was torn apart with the complicity of union leaders. Railroad workers, as Repetti, left a question that was hard to answer. What do we own in this museum? This is a tricky question because you can own things, but with that question, it is impossible to tag it. And this question comes depending on the modest capital of this museum, the incapacity to sketch what is possible after using a magnifier to see this distribution of assets by our society. So probably the first thing you see in Ferrowhite is not the first what you see, but the hands holding it. Because in addition to a museum on the history of the railroad and the museum, it's a museum workshop. Things are manufactured in addition to being exhibited. And a museum workshop leaves marks. It creates an identity that is stored under your nails. These are the hands of Pedro Caballero. I'm going to say it with the words of a former colleague of ours. How to say that? A wrench is nothing but a piece of iron, but a wrench in the hands of Pedro Caballero and any other railroad worker is a very valuable object. And that wrench is in the port, in the railroad, in the grains, in the World Bank. Thomas Larkin and his plan to rationalize our railroads, and Osvaldo Ceci, the union leaders, and Hugo Vieira, that was a soccer player when a soccer player made less money than a railroad worker. And Mario Leliondo, that was a colleague of Hugo, and worked with him, with Osvaldo and Pedro and the rest of the strikers, and then ended up in jail. All of that was known to Pedro Caballero. That's why he could donate this wrench to the museum, saying this is a historic object. Because there's not a large history and a small history. There's not a history of leaders and other of the common people. There's just history, lived, changing, diverse, contradictory. But what Pedro's hands hold in this picture is not from a railroad, but from a work. Maybe today, 10 years later, the great donor for this execution would not be a person but the sea. In this waterway, we get many things every day. Some remains from that trek. From that wreck, we get tires, we get soybean grains, and sometimes pieces of wood that comes from the suspended works of the mining company Vale. But why would it be worth to incorporate this to the collection of a museum? Because after working with that is just the tip of the iceberg. That would be something that will take us through our relation, through the times, through the grains of the transnational company, to the infrastructure and the works that they made possible throughout the years. With the changing protagonists, with the revenues that they generated, often extraordinary, the exploitation by the capitalists, and workers, the community, and the state. Everyone finds support in this prop that Pedro is showing here and putting in your own hands, but understanding that forces us to do something with that prop, forces us to do something with the arms we have here in this place in order to do something with that. That is why with this wood we manufacture toolboxes, bar tables, the pieces of a game that allows us to understand the movement of the port with every kid that comes visit our museum. And in addition to that, this bench, this stool. Building in a workshop museum implies appropriating these practices and turning them public in order to reconfigure, based on this part, this image of the whole that, even if partial, helps us identify the continuity but also the alternatives to an order that often negotiates its permanence through change. A vision virtually impossible, we will not deny that, but we want to support. 10 years after its inauguration, Ferrowhite would never have become what it is without Adolfo and Pedro, that are no longer with us, which confronts us with the idea that the main patrimony of this museum is not the architecture, the object, or its curatorial skills. In a museum workshop, we are currently under siege by the suspicion that it's only possible to keep that what you transform. That stool is just a temporary support. something that will help us part with what we have in our hands in order to take distance from our daily concerns. This is also a portable opportunity to take a break and sit down in order to hatch an idea. And that is where we will support it in order to take a leap. Thank you.
Gracias, Nicolás. Próximo presentador es Carlomagno.
Carlomagno Pedro Martínez was born in Oaxaca, Mexico in 1965. He studied in the Basic Arts School, Otomayo, to become a ceramic instructor. And he also is a professor of basic arts, curator of the Popular Art Museum of Oaxaca. He has over 20 years of experience in different exhibitions in Mexico and throughout the world. In Mexico, he has received the National Youth Prize in 1987 in Arts and Popular Traditions, National Award for Arts and Sciences in 2014, and he struggles to preserve the indigenous identity through the popular art. And as it is said in English, it's for disclosure. He's a very good man. I've known him for many, many years. He's a wonderful artist. Carlomagno, my good friend. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to come from the Oaxaca Valley lands. I'm Wayne-Fi in my language, thinking person. People who come from my town. I come from an indigenous population in Oaxaca, and I would like to tell a story that is in line with reimagining museums or how community museums change lives. Let me tell you about a museum that was reimagined twice. These are some of my ideas. A museum is a place where the treasure and cultural value of human intelligence is promoted and preserved. Through this timeline, I would like to give you an example of how museums evolve when we reimagine it. In 1905, there's a man called Manuel Guzman. He is a very successful butcher who came back to his hometown, and he sees no way of providing his people or his town with culture. So he donated his land to the municipal authorities because he lived right next door to the municipality. He told municipal indigenous authorities that he donated this land for it to be a cultural center for children and for people in the town to have something to take pride in. In 1907, the first primary school was founded in that same building. As from then until 1994, where I had the idea of building the Popular Arts Museum, Municipal Museum. The idea of reimagining the museum started with Manuel Guzman. He dreamt about having a cultural space in an indigenous population. In 1997, through my work on black mud, I studied to become a professor of plastic arts, but I prefer to work with the materials of my community, building skulls, for example. The Mexican Mexican government said, okay, this boy is interested in defending our national identity. That's how I got a prize in 1987 for being an advocate of our national or popular arts. So I thought, how can I give back to my community? 1968, some people came from Bill Ullman and René Arce Frutos. They saw my work and they invited me in 1989 to visit the museum. That's the second time I started reimagining a museum. I was quite impressed with the Mexican-American community and a bunch of faculty members that were trying to rescue the Mexican culture and their introduction through the museum. I remember I was quite shocked because this was a very large area, like those self-service centers that are so popular in the US. I don't want to name names, but it was like this big service stores. And I came across the general director, who was very kind to me, and in his willing to teach, he started to explain why he was brought to the U.S. I was semi-literate by then, and he explained to me of the importance of this museum forum to educate people. It's not to cater to tourists, as many would think. It's about trying to educate the youth, educate children, high schoolers, university students. It is very important to be able to portray the human conscience through art. In my case, I come from an indigenous people who are working on the Coyotepec mud or black clay. But there's 16 live ethnics, 170 municipalities, 140,000 inhabitants who are working on the true native clay work in Oaxaca. There was a contemporary art museum in that. It's sarcastic or ironic to see that in this location there was a modern arts museum, but there was no museum portraying our work. They used to call our work crafts that were sold to tourists. In 1994, there was a General Assembly of indigenous populations. They are quite strong. They are conferences such as this one, and if you are successful in your proposal, you will find it out right away. But if you're not, they will boo you. They will throw tomatoes at you. So you will find out right away that your proposal was not accepted. And I started talking, and I heard some people talking. I thought they were going to start booing me. And Facundo León Pérez was present. He stood up, and he used to read books that came to town. He was a very highly educated person, and he projected what he learned through reading. So he took off his hat and he said, "Don't boo this young man. He has good ideas. Culture will never hurt a town. It will make it greater. It's a gift of the peoples to propose and to promote their artists. Let him talk." And they gave me a round of applause. This is how the Popular Arts Museum was born in Coyontepec. In the year 2000, the Community Museum, it's an idea that was born in Mexico. The INA, the Anthropological Institute from Mexico, has regulations to rule how people will collect art. Municipalities are free, though, in Colatepec. So each people or each town acts as its own country. They decide who is going to run and and how this is going to work. So municipal authorities, after having worked as a municipal museum for 4 years, we went to see the governor of the state, and we proposed an idea. We are not very keen on writing our ideas, but rather on sharing them orally. The governor talked to us, and he said, I understand exactly what you're trying to tell me. Give me some time, and I will see how we do it so that we tear down this old building. It used to be an old school. It was operative for over 30 years, but it was obsolete due to the earthquakes in the area. And finally, they decided to open the Popular Art Museum in Oaxaca, a state museum. Fortunately for indigenous peoples, this museum holds the Popular Arts Gallery. It changed my life. So from being a plastic art, a visual art artist, I turned into a promoter, a manager of this cultural center. I feel like Atlas, right? Instead of with having the world on his shoulders, I have this museum on my shoulders. It's very difficult, as Carlos was saying, to pull it through. We need to struggle against ignorance and discrimination every day. Now I can freely say that a contemporary art museum in Oaxaca, for example, gets 2 to 3 million pesos. The Popular Arts Museum from the Indians or natives, they get 440,000 pesos. But I keep working, and I won't lose my strength as Pancho Villa, promoter of the Mexican movement, says that I'm talking to my people, and that's how I put together my battalion. And I would say, I talk to my people, and we put together a museum. This is how we started working on the old school, and we had exhibitions with my fellow craftsmen. Finally, this building was put up 4 meters high. This was the museum that was created in Oaxaca to be a museum. This is the historical reference of people from Coyotepec. These are the contemporary artists or originary from the indigenous populations. They are working with me and they have supported me. I would like to deeply thank foundations such as FOFA, Friends of Oaxacan Folk Art from New York. They are helping us to promote this. And the Fine Arts Museum that gives us funds. This museum run by Carlos Tortolero. It is very, very difficult to survive through austerity. That's what we're fighting against. And it's the same thing for all museums and cultural centers. The artists, popular artists and craftsmen give us their work for us to exhibit. We hold 4 exhibitions per year. These are some of the images. It is an educational museum as well. So museums change communities' lives. Community museums transform, and the reimagined museum, it's all about adding up imagination to move forward. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Carlomagno. Our last panelist is David Anderson. He was born in Belfast in Northern Ireland, grew up in the English Midlands, and studied Irish history at Edinburgh University in Scotland. After first working as a history teacher, that's how I began too, in a state comprehensive school, he began his museum career as an educator in Brighton, in England, before moving to the National Maritime Museum in London, and then the V&A in London. In 2010, he joined, you have to pronounce this for me in Welsh, I'm going to blow it.
Edward Cymru.
That's right, the National Museum of Wales as the director. Since then, he has begun a major 42 million redevelopment at the St. Fagans Open Air Museum, which will transform it to become the National Museum of History for Wales, with co-production at the center of its relationship with communities across Wales. As a result of the destruction of industry in Wales by the UK government and its imposition of neoliberal ideologies and austerity, Wales has the highest levels of poverty in the United Kingdom and some of the highest in Europe. In a partnership with the Welsh government, the museum is now leading research and evaluation for a national project to overcome the consequences of poverty in Wales' poorest communities through cultural participation. David.
Thank you. I first want to say that I feel privileged to be on the platform with the speakers I've just heard, and also grateful to be invited to speak at this conference, which I sense will be one of the defining conferences of this decade, and which will be an important starting point, really, for a rethinking of the purpose of museums, a rebalancing of museums. And I want to start with the Museums Association's Museums Change Lives project, really, which has been controversial in the United Kingdom. We have to be honest, there are deeply conservative forces, certainly in the UK in the museum sector, and possibly in other nations as well. And to argue that that museums can have a powerful social purpose is in itself a controversial statement for some. The program proposes that museums should enhance well-being, create better places, and inspire people and values. And I want to talk of some of my own inspiration just very briefly, really. William Morris, most famous for designing wallpaper to some, but actually an increasingly urgent campaigner for social justice as well in Britain. And I think now that we should recognize that he made a massive contribution to social thought as well as to art and design. And fundamental to his idea was the concept of the education of desire, to encourage people to believe that they could improve the quality of their lives, and the critical role of culture and in cultural practice and creativity in doing that. I should just say where Wales is, because many people don't know. It's the western nation of the United Kingdom, or an increasingly disunited kingdom, as we now are. And as a nation, we are now emerging and exploring our own identities. And our own vision for the museum, which we've just rethought, is that it's our job to inspire people, and it's also our job to help them to change their lives in ways they wish to do. St. Fagans is changing from a social history museum, an open-air museum, to become a National Museum of History. And that brings huge responsibilities with it, that we should not propagate comfortable myths, that we should not ignore our own dark histories within Wales, that we should not always blame England for the things that don't work, that we should be adults. And the museum has a crucial role in developing the critical thinking, the acceptance of responsibility, as well as the commitment to change things for a better future, as part of our responsibility as an institution. And part of this is changing the way we work, from being a place for the people, as we've always said, however true or untrue that may have been for different people, not just a museum that's about people being able to be active, but a museum where people truly participate in the work of the whole organization. There isn't time for me to explore fully how we're trying to apply to what was and has been, and still in many ways is, a very traditional national museum, the concept of cultural democracy. But cultural democracy is fundamental, and it's something that we have to explore, and we have to really change our work to embrace. And as part of that, also that people are naturally creative. And it's part of our work to ensure that that creativity can be expressed within the museum and should be inspired to be used elsewhere. essential to this process is working with many other organizations. The museum has now consulted and worked with over 200 organizations across Wales in the process of redeveloping the museum, which we're still in the middle of doing. These are just a small selection of some of those organizations, and they range from charities that support drug users through to charities which support people who are homeless. And these charities are not our only partners. More particularly, it is drug users, homeless people, and others who are our partners as well. The charities are a way for us to work more effectively with them. And one project I'll mention briefly is Refugee House, and that was a project to work over many years with the refugees and asylum seekers who came to Wales from across the world, and who were and are still quite marginal in UK society, including in Wales. Those charities that worked with the refugees wanted us to put on display typical home spaces, a kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom from real people and real homes. A very sensitive project, but one that the refugees themselves were very keen to do. And they were the interpreters in the galleries, not the museum staff. They were the interpreters in the galleries, meeting the public as they came through. And some members of the public were hostile to them, some of them were hugely supportive, but the dialogue was taking place. And in the part of the refugees, it was a very brave act to do, to expose oneself almost in every way to the public. But we believe that it worked well as a project, and it created a different kind of public space too. However, co-production has its dark side. Everything in life has a dark side, and heaven knows museums truly have a dark side as well, very often, in the ways we work with the public. And National Theatre Wales did a project around refugees and asylum seekers at the same time, which put you into the role of a refugee, and then you yourself, as a member of the audience, went on a journey through railway stations to try to cross borders. And when you were caught, as I was participating in this, then members of the public online would listen to your story with the police, and they would decide whether you should be let into Wales or not. All this is theatre, really. And it was a reminder of how often citizens can be co-opted by governments into doing their work. And that co-production, therefore, is something which isn't just a pure good. Nothing is a pure good. It's all how it's used. Now, I wanted just to finish with a video. This is the story of one of the volunteers.
Battle of the Balkans. Joanna and I were married December the 28th, 2005 in Newcastle, her hometown, although we lived in Barry. One day in June 2006, I looked at her and said, "Let's buy a house in Bulgaria." To which she replied, "Have you lost your marbles? What's Bulgaria? Why?" I said, "'Cause it's there, in the middle bit." So I decided we would do it. She said, "Okay, great." So we went and chose a farm-type place and bought it. The house, the barns, sheds, land needed total rebuilding, but the foundations and the house was almost livable. Although it looked like an impossible job, the newly married couple were determined. After a while, we decided to start our own business, selling and buying houses for British people for a small fee. It was my idea, but I asked her if she would do the business side because I was now building 2 houses. It needed a lot of work doing. After 4 years, my wife said to me, "Would you sign the houses in her name to save me going with her 40 miles away to the bank every time she needed my signature, which always lost me a day's work?" I said, "No problem, love. The houses were now in her name only." I know now why. Later that month, all was done, including swimming pool. I was so happy. A few days later in August, my best friend, my brother, died aged 53. I was distraught. 4 days after that, my wife all of a sudden told me She had met another man and I was no longer required. My homes were in her name. What could I do? Within 4 days I lost my best friend in the world, my wife, stepson, animals, and my fantastic home, which took me 4 years non-stop work. To leave Bulgaria, she gave me a tiny pink case so as I wouldn't have to pay excess baggage. I came back to Bari. Over the next 3 months, I was on a mission to kill myself with total alcohol. In November, I was dead, but still breathing. I had 1 inch of life left when I decided enough and searched for help. I found a hostel for alcoholics and was given 2 years rehab. Over the next 6 months, I was housebound when my key worker asked me if I would like to try some voluntary work at St. Fagans. I said yes. I was terrified of going out, but made so welcome by all the staff. They made me feel wanted. The volunteers were nice as well. They're my friends now, and I'm alive again. I would say to other people who have given up, find that 1 inch and try that something else that brings you back to life. Thank you, St. Fagans.
I should say that Paul wanted that film to be made so that he could encourage other people to see how museums can help people in his sort of position. And so he very much wants the film to be shown in public, despite the fact that it's such a personal story and he reveals so much about himself. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
I want to ask a question to Nicolás from Ferrowhite. I wanted to ask you, after hearing your words, you said that this was a community work. So how are you recruiting the other people who work as a community with you, the workers, the rail workers who are no longer there? How will you continue and sustain this work? Well, it's not only rail workers or port workers. It's important to stress that. We do not want to be all about the specificity of one relationship or one link. We're working with school students and other people who are not railway workers. I wouldn't use the term recruiting. We do not recruit somebody. We're not advocates to a cause. There's just affinity. And as a result of that affinity, they become members of our team, of our group. We have different relationships with different types of people. Closer links, not so close links. Usually, we have an interview with a person at that person's house. We go back to the house. Sometimes that person comes to the museum and they start collaborating with us, and they start sticking with us. It's like a chain effect. A friend of a friend talked to me about the museum. Attilio de Lianelli, for example, one of the persons that worked with us from the inception, met Carlos. He was depressed at the port. He was retired. He found no meaning in life. And he told him, why don't you go meet these guys? They are a bit crazy, but maybe you'll be interested in their work. And this is how the chain effect works. To anyone and everyone, all our panel members, in your opinion, what's the role, what's the contribution of community museums in representing and managing culture? The implicancies of community museums like ours is that they trigger the desire or interest among the youth to promote love and the promotion of their original works as indigenous artists so that they feel more deeply rooted to their communities. In Mexico, migration is very strong. Young people tend to migrate to the north, to the U.S. I had no time to explain this, but we work through scholarships and programs through international organizations, the effect of which, or repercussion of which, is that the community where the museum is located fills the museum of its own forum. And the idea is to reinforce youth and childhood. Childhood is very important in building your own identity. That's our outreach to the communities through the museum and other cultural centers. This question is for Ferrowhite and Maré, the two different presentations. How do you fund your museums? In Argentina, this is quite a critical work, a critical issue, economic resources for museums. It's a very important issue. Brazil is going through an economic crisis, and we're all about cutting costs. There's a culture of reducing costs, especially in the South, and the return that we have through these actions is so big, the potential is so big that we pay attention to this. It's a federal program, and we live out of the will of the community. Many people work as volunteers, people who try to contribute somehow. The community supports us, but the issue, the institutionalization issue is very difficult. The museum is living through a problem. The company that owns the warehouse or our location requested to have it back. So those warehouses cannot be rented. They are not useful. But we are running the risk of being evicted. They asked us to evict and vacate this building, but we have the support of the community, we have the support of the communities, of museums of Rio de Janeiro, and we're delaying this eviction to March. We're working, and we're confident that people will not ask us to give them something we will not be able to comply with. We have a different logic, we have free activities, free of charge activities, and we are highly dependent on the government. There's a lot of funding through the government, and it's important to get government funding. We have to modify the concept of community museums. What does it mean? Where are we embedded? We're not alien objects. How does management work? Museums have to be self-sustainable, but if we cannot charge for any activities, how will we be able to sustain ourselves? What's the role of the community? How do we engage community? How do we have them show their affection and interest? We're not talking about past, we're talking about the future. Ferrowhite is a state-owned museum. It's a municipal museum. It depends on the Bahía Blanca municipality, but it was originally built through an Antorchas Foundation bid process and a contest. We also get funding from voluntary donations and donation of products. And this stool, for example, this bench is for sale. This is another source of income for us. I didn't mean to publicize our products here, but well, since you ask, we try to work based on this government pillar, and Ferrowhite and the Port Museum located in Ingeniero White are promoted by the government. And we have grown through the contribution of different associations and foundations, and there's also a parallel economy that may represent pennies, but pennies keep coming in, and they allow us to manage better. The accountant of the museum is looking straight at me. She won't allow me to lie. A round of applause for all of them. Thank you very much.
Gracias.